Most of the research right now in psychedelics is really focused on like depression, anxiety, PTSD, but there's also been quite a bit of research on some of these neurodegenerative diseases, and there's actually a really interesting kind of niche that is gaining popularity within the psychedelic space. And what that is that companies are now trying to take the psychedelic experience out of psychedelics and seeing if these compounds still have efficacy.
This is Vibe Science, a top 100 wellness podcast presented by the Radcast Network, breaking wellness barriers and making health truly personal. Here's your host, Ryan Alford.
Hello, and welcome to Vibe Science. Chris, what's up today?
How you doing, my man?
I'm pumped. We got a great guest today. CEO and founder of Your Investments, Mr. Psychedelic Law, Mr. Cannabis Law, Dustin Robinson. What's up, Dustin?
What's up, buddy? We're doing great. Appreciate you guys having me on.
Hey, man, let's set the table for our listeners. I know you call yourself a consciouspreneur. Got your hands in a lot of things, but let's give everybody the old ones and twos on you, Dustin, and who you are, what you do, and then we'll go down whatever road we want to.
Absolutely, yeah. So by education, I'm an attorney, also a licensed CPA and a licensed realtor. Have a few different companies that I founded. One is my law firm. My law firm is pretty much full service for highly regulated industries. I also have a nonprofit that advocates for legal reform around psychedelic medicines. My investment fund is Eater Investments. That's where I focus most of my time. We invest in alternative solutions for mental and behavioral health. We're currently one of the largest investors in psychedelic research. And then I also have a venture studio called Nucleus where we launch digital media assets. So yeah, got my hands full on doing a lot of different stuff, but most of it is really around breaking false social constructs around us, breaking stigma, and really mental and behavioral health. I think, right now when you look at society, I think the largest problem we're facing right now is the mental health crisis. Over 1 billion people globally are suffering with some sort of mental health indication. I actually think that's understated. I think it's more than that. And the current pharmaceuticals out there just aren't effective the way they need to be. The SSRIs and the benzos that were developed decades ago, there's just been little to no innovation. So I think society is really ready for some alternative therapies and alternative solutions to address this enormous problem we have.
Dustin, that's awesome, man. You got your hands on a lot of things. I'm going to go right at something because you're a smart guy. You're in the industry. And I guess if we all knew the answer to this, we probably would all be a lot better off. But I'm going to go at it anyway. Why is the stigma with psychedelic medicine and psychedelic as a whole? I understand. I am not the one. Let me just say where I stand on these things. I am not. I mean, I grew up in South Carolina. I've lived everywhere, but I certainly probably lean towards the conservative profile, but I have some very liberal, probably, beliefs and tendencies as well. With that said, grew up very conservative, but sometimes logic has to overtake tendencies or upbringing or, ignorance. And why at this stage, I understand I don't want every drug the way they've done it in freaking, Oregon or wherever, to be legal. I think that's ridiculous. There needs to be some regulation. But why in 2024, if there is potentially medication from the earth or wherever that could help people with mental issues and other challenges, why is it such a roadblock? Why would we get in our own way? Again, we don't want people tripping on every corner, but to use it for medicinal purposes for mental health, why the hell has it got to be so hard to get these tests and these regulations taken care of?
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. I'm actually have a very similar background to you. I mean, I grew up my whole life. I actually never tried a drug up until 3 years ago, so it's kind of ironic that I'm kind of so focused on this space. So I grew up my whole life basically just believing what society told me. Go to accounting school, get your master's in accounting, go to law school, work at a big firm. I just really didn't question the social constructs around me. And as I started, I had my first exit about 6 years ago. I sold a manufacturing company that I was running. And that's when I really kind of stepped out of the box and started looking at, what are my passions? What am I interested in? And I started representing a lot of doctors in the space. And those doctors are the ones that kind of educated me on the benefits of psychedelics. I grew up my whole life. I had a lot of friends that did psychedelics. I never judged them, but I thought they like turn your brain into mush. I was always growing up into sports, health and wellness, and I basically fed into the stigma. I totally thought they turn your brain to mush, and then all of a sudden these doctors are sending me research, basically out of Johns Hopkins, Yale, NYU. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. Some of the top research institutions were coming out with research around psychedelics, and I was reading about the neuroplasticity, dendrite growth, neurogenesis, how they're helping with all these various indications, and it just sparked my curiosity. So I had my first, I started investing in the space and representing clients through my law firm in the space, and then obviously a lot of my clients were like, "Hey, you're like the lawyer that represents all of us. Like, you need to have your own experience." So I had my own experience, and I was just blown away that it was the complete opposite what society had always told me. Rather than turning your brain to mush, it actually lit my brain up. You feel parts of your brain talking to one another that don't talk to one another. I had tremendous perspective. Like, I felt so focused, and I felt this sense of clarity within my brain, not mush in my brain. And so that's actually what really inspired me after having that experience. That just validated all the research that I was reading. I was like, wow, okay, this makes a lot of sense once I experienced it. So that's when I started, I formalized my fund, and, we raised tens of millions of dollars and started deploying capital into the space. And we've made a lot of strides on the stigma side and the legal front. Right now, MDMA, as of just yesterday, they received their approval from the FDA on their NDA to get reviewed. So MDMA for PTSD will likely be an FDA-approved pharmaceutical in August of 2024. After that, the DEA will have 90 days to reschedule. Some of the states don't adopt the DEA rescheduling, so they'll have to reschedule. But we are right on the brink. I think probably early to mid 2025, we are going to see MDMA as a pharmaceutical available for people with PTSD. And right behind that, you have a phase 3 clinical trial on psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. There's another one for major depressive disorder. We've invested in DMT. We started investing in a lot of short-acting psychedelics like 5-MeO and DMT and novel short-acting psychedelics. They're one company we have that's reducing the length of the trip for psilocybin. So there's a lot of interesting things, and I think this MDMA FDA approval is really going to start knocking down a lot of barriers. But just like you said, we're also seeing simultaneously Oregon, Colorado, these different states rolling out their own legal frameworks. And it's interesting because when I first got into this space, I was pretty naive. Like I said, I never tried any psychedelics. So I started talking to all the different nonprofits and trying to understand. And there's one particular nonprofit, Decrim Nature, that's probably the best known. They've got like hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram. And Carlos and Larry, the founders, I spent a lot of time talking to them, and they educated me quite a bit on the indigenous use. I was really into the mental health aspects, but I wanted to learn more. And the more I learned, I started to develop my own personal perspectives on things. And I actually differ a lot with some of these different nonprofits. A lot of them are just about like decrim, as if these are oranges or bananas, let everyone grow. And the reality is like, the best thing we could do, these compounds are powerful. They could be used for good, but they could also be misused. So I think it's very important that you have a proper regulatory framework so that these things are properly labeled, they're manufactured properly. You really have the proper framework and guardrails around it. Because what happened in the 70s is they got in the hands of the wrong people, and people weren't using them responsibly. And the worst thing that could happen for the industry is that we repeat that history and take 10 steps back. So I think it's very important as we roll out these compounds that we put up proper guardrails. That's what my nonprofit is focused on, creating responsible legal reform around psychedelic medicines.
Do you think, is it as simple, the roadblocks that still exist, that are getting better? You highlighted it. The MDMA thing would be huge, will be huge. But are the roadblocks as simple as we have a lot of politicians that are 65 to 75 years old that remember those 70s and don't want to repeat it, and they're just so they can't unwire from the mainframe? Like it's just
The
programmed
programming is
that
deep.
this is good, this is bad. It's
Well,
all black and white.
that's. I think it's really, once again, I come back to social constructs. I mean, just around 5 years ago, before I started reading the research, I felt the same as some of these politicians that, like I was in their seat
So
just
did
five
I.
years ago,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not some, I'm not some like crazy guy who takes unrealistic and irrational positions, but society had told me this, and I just believed it. So I think a lot of it is just simply educating. That's why I'm so passionate about, the big distinction between the cannabis and the psychedelic industry is that the psychedelic industry is really progressing through this FDA clinical trials, proving it out through scientific research, objective scientific research, whereas cannabis really mainly went through these state authorized frameworks where they weren't doing, double blind placebo studies proving the efficacy and the safety. So the psychedelic industry right now, so much research is coming out, and if these politicians just take the time to read this research, they will understand that these compounds have tremendous potential and a really good safety profile. When you do FDA clinical trials, phase one is really all about safety. Phase two is when you start really getting into efficacy, and phase three as well. And so safety is very important. You could have a super effective drug, but if it's, has a high likelihood for abuse or, has other side effects and it's not safe, it's no good. But what's amazing about these psychedelic compounds is that they actually have an incredibly good safety profile. There's Dr. David Nutt out of Imperial College of London, who's the chief medical officer of one of our portfolio companies. Several years ago, he did a study on this and took nicotine, alcohol, cocaine, all these different compounds, and basically did a study on their safety profile. And psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, these compounds were like the lowest on like likelihood for abuse. So they're very, very safe compounds. And what's interesting about MDMA for PTSD is it really talks to both sides of the aisle, because so many veterans could potentially be helped. Over 13 million people in America suffer from PTSD. So many of them are veterans. Obviously, on the conservative side of the aisle, there's a lot of big veteran advocates. So you're actually starting to see a lot of the people on the conservative side really starting to look at this research and the potential these compounds can have. But I think the main thing is, as long as it goes through the proper federal pathways, I think you're always going to see people hating on like what they're doing in Oregon and Colorado. I'm not hating on it, but that's a tougher approach. But when you go through the clinical trials, which by the way cost hundreds of millions of dollars, MAPS just raised up. MAPS is the company that is doing the MDMA phase 3 trial that's going to get it approved. They just raised another 100 million. I mean, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on proving this out. It's very expensive. But once you do that, you have data to support, and their phase 3 trials for MAPS are actually called Lycos now. They just did a name change. So Lycos, their phase 3 data showed that 2/3 of the participants in their phase 3 trial were no longer clinically diagnosed with PTSD, and over 80% of the participants had a positive reaction to the medication. So, the research is amazing. That's like a huge medical breakthrough, got written up in Nature magazine. So once you provide these politicians with the data, and that's why we're starting to see so many huge strides from knocking down these different legal blockades and getting these medicines approved.
What's the dosage on like the MDMA for PTSD? Because I'll say this, not really joking, just being truthful. I mean, that's about the best I've ever felt when I did MDMA. But it was also kind of the worst I'd ever felt the next day. It's like, yeah,
Well, it's
too much
interesting you
fun.
say that. Well, I think so. That I love that statement, because I think
Yeah.
that's one of the big problems. Like with psychedelics, your set and your setting is just so important. And
Yeah.
I'm actually grateful I waited as long as I did to try my first psychedelic compound. And I think what MDMA does is it reduces the levels of your amygdala and it releases oxytocin. Your amygdala is what causes like fear and emotion. So, if you have PTSD and you think of whatever the trauma is, your amygdala is getting hyper aroused and you can't think straight. So what MDMA does is it reduces that amygdala and it releases oxytocin, and you have this sense of connectedness. That's why I don't know if you took it at a club or a festival or whatever, the people you were with, you probably had
There's
a
a
deep
concert. Yeah,
feeling
I
of,
think I hugged
yeah,
everyone at the show.
exactly. But here's what's super important. I think when you're young, you do that and you look back at that event and you're just like, wow, that event was amazing. I felt so much love because of MDMA, but now I don't feel that love. But in reality, through integration, through really reflecting on the experience, that love was within you. That feeling you felt was very, very real. So for me, my first MDMA experience, it was just a window for my capacity to love. And when I reflect on that, when I meditate every morning, I genuinely believe I could bring myself back to that feeling. Like the MDMA just showed me my capacity. So don't let that one experience just be one experience. Let it be a lesson that you have that within you. And since that first MDMA experience, like I have a deep sense of connection and love and understanding for this planet. And I think that's where people really miss out on like the opportunity with MDMA. They take it, they have that one experience and they just chalk up the experience, that one experience. They don't stop and reflect and recognize that that love and that connectedness they felt is within them. The medicine just helped them basically feel that emotion.
You know, we talked about the MDMA. You know, I'll say this, and maybe this will put perspective for you and maybe how to frame this. My mom is suffering from like early dementia, early Alzheimer's. Her mother had it. Short-term memory. You know, she's active. Like my grandmother had Alzheimer's and didn't have she drank 4 pots of coffee a day and sat at her kitchen table for 15 years and died at 85 because her brain shut down, but every organ in her body worked perfect. You know, my mom is probably headed down the same path, no health issues whatsoever, except her brain. What are we seeing in, you know, as it goes with psychedelics and that sort of thing? I've heard a lot of stuff bubbling around that, dementia and Alzheimer's and all that with psychedelics.
Absolutely. So like, yeah, those are all, they're neurodegenerative diseases is basically what they're classified as. And, you know, there's been some research on it. Most of the research right now in psychedelics is really focused on like depression, anxiety, PTSD, but there's also been quite a bit of research on some of these neurodegenerative diseases. And there's actually a really interesting kind of niche that is gaining popularity within the psychedelic space. And what that is that companies are now trying to take the psychedelic experience out of psychedelics and seeing if these compounds still have efficacy. So essentially what they're doing is they're not hitting the 5-HT2A receptor, which is responsible for that subjective hallucinatory experience, because there are certain physiological changes that happen in the brain when you take psychedelics. So the question is, could those physiological changes actually be helpful even if we block the actual trip from happening? We block that 5-HT2A receptor. So we've invested in one company that is doing it. You know, there's been very little research on this, but we invest in a company called Solera that's doing absolutely tremendous research. And my thesis around this particular space is that I think for like depression and PTSD, some of these really, where you're in this constant loop of negative thoughts, even addiction, I think you probably need that subjective experience because it really rattles your brain and gives you a different way of thinking of things. But I actually think neurodegenerative diseases is a really interesting space. So the indication that Solera is going after is actually a neurodegenerative. It's a form of dementia, basically, is what they're going after. So that's not to say the full psychedelic experiences can't also help with the neurodegenerative. We'll see. There needs to be more research. But in the non-psychedelic psychedelic space, I know that's kind of an oxymoron. I think there's a lot of potential because when you're dealing with neurodegenerative diseases, there's something, it's physiological. It's not necessarily like you're in this constant loop of negative thoughts like depression or addiction. So we're doing research, and you know, I think there's a lot of people in this industry that like are a little bit too overzealous, and they're like, it's gonna change the world and it's gonna help with every disease, and I'm like, I'm very, very research oriented. You know, maybe it's just a result of my background in education. Just like I'm always questioning things. And so until we do the research, we just don't know. But I think, you know, they've done animal studies, and the animal studies have shown to be very, very positive. But we've healed every indication known to man through animals. That doesn't always translate into humans. So Solera actually is going to be moving into their first human trials within the next few months. And that's when we'll really know.
What are things that maybe our audience would be interested to know that you're seeing, whether it's in the psychedelics, we've talked about some of them, or in cannabis law, like, you know, we've talked about the MDMA trials. That's exciting. That's one thing. But is there other things, or both positive or negative, that might have impact and might surprise people that you're, you know, that kind of hit your desk every day?
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas we're looking pretty deeply and we've started to invest quite a bit in is these short-acting psychedelic compounds. So, the challenge from a commercialization perspective with psilocybin and MDMA is that, you kind of need to be in a clinic for like 6 to 8 hours to experience them, right? So that's not ideal from an access perspective. It's also not ideal from a cost perspective. That's expensive to have therapists sitting with someone for that long. So there's these other psychedelic compounds and really novel psychedelic compounds too. A lot of people forget like LSD and MDMA, they were made in a lab, right? And like in the 70s when we had the Controlled Substances Act, the research just stopped on finding new psychedelic molecules. They all mostly MDMA is an entactogen, but most of them work on like your serotonin system, your 5-HT2A receptor. And so there's all these different receptors in your brain. So what we're investing a lot in is these novel psychedelic compounds that are hitting certain serotonin receptors that we want to hit and not hitting other serotonin receptors, ideally in a short duration, which will increase access and make them far more affordable. So, we kind of by default ended up with MDMA because there's such a long history with it. It's an incredible molecule, but there's a lot of innovation happening with other entactogens. MDMA is an entactogen, but there's a lot of companies now developing different entactogens that act a little bit differently from MDMA. So I think there's a ton of innovation. I think a lot of people get caught up like on the patent landscape in the psychedelic industry. Like you can't patent nature, you can't patent psilocybin, you can't and they think like the pharmaceutical companies are evil. And we're very, very intentional about not investing in companies that take improper patent positions, but there's so much innovation going on as well. And at the end of the day, in order to get a patent, it needs to be novel and unique and have utility, right? So something out of nature is not novel or unique. So you can't patent nature. However, if you're taking nature and you're improving upon it and creating a shorter trip or a more steady trip or whatever it might be, you're innovating and you're adding value to society, and therefore you could get a patent for that. And that's stuff that we love. And I'm super excited to see the innovation that's currently occurring within the psychedelic space. Another area we're very interested in is the virtual reality for therapeutics. It's very, very nascent. Paratherapeutics kind of like knocked down a lot of the barriers. It's one of the first like digital tools that was FDA approved, and they actually haven't had a great stock performance, so that's shied away a lot of investors. The biggest challenge I think with like VR and digital therapeutics is just adoption. Even me, I bought my VR headset and we started investing in a company that thought it was awesome, and now it just sits on my desk. It's very hard to get people to. I think the younger generations are more comfortable with it, putting it on and using it. But getting hospitals and clinics to buy these headsets and get their patients to use these headsets. But I do think we're very, very early in the technology. I think it still has a long way to go. But that's another area that I think is going to be very, very interesting in developing new solutions for mental health.
Yeah, the Vision Pro, I want to do like the Radcast or one of our other shows. Like I was wearing that the whole time. Like you get disoriented. The whole
it's
augmented
super
reality.
Yeah, it's disorienting, and I think we're gonna look back 5-10 years from now and laugh at how silly the Vision Pro was. Like we're just getting a little taste of what the technology could be, but in the future, it's gonna be like contact lenses, and you're with your brain gonna be able to like pull up and transition to AI or AR, whatever you want to go into, and it won't be disorienting. It'll be much more simple. Won't be a big clunky headpiece. But this is really like version 1, and once we get to like version 8, I think things are going to start getting very interesting.
Any final questions or comments, Chris, with Dustin before we let him get out of here?
I think this was a great show. I think super informative for the average people, but
Yeah,
you just nailed everything, dude. Just to give people a background, I saw Dustin speak actually at a conference, one of the cannabis conferences down here in Miami, like about a year ago, actually, right? Literally, like I think a year ago. and dude, it's funny at these conferences, and we kind of touched on this, but like you don't look like the average dude that's going to be talking about psychedelics. At least, like, maybe nowadays it's more common, but 5 years ago, it's some dude with dreadlocks, engaged ears, and tie-dye. and respect to those dudes, they were laying the frontier of the game, but it's people like you, and I think that's why, we've become friendly down here. We've hung out a few times where it's like, and I was the same way. I was completely anti-psychedelics, ignorant. My buddies had done them in college, and I was like, whatever. But like you, I had a profound experience and was like, holy shit, man. And now it's just like you trying to break that stigma and get the word out there. And it's so much years of old programming, right, that we're breaking through. But I think it's extremely exciting. And I think what I love the most is, like you said, making laws, where it excites me to have people like you that are lawmakers, right, or lawyers that you've dipped your toes in the water. You know what it's about. I think the bigger lesson is, like Ryan said, for so long we've had these politicians stuck in their ways, voting on things they have no idea what they're talking about, whether it's psychedelics, cannabis, just people that have never experienced any of these things, making these massive decisions that are just roadblocking the rest of us. So I'm excited to see what happens, and I'm just glad that you're on our side of our side of the team.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And yeah, it's funny because I had conversations with some of these kind of dreadlock hippies or whatever years ago, and they give their woo-woo talk, and I kind of roll my eyes like, these guys are crazy. Yeah. And the reality is those guys were enlightened, but unfortunately just through their presentation, because of society, like, they weren't able to communicate some of these thoughts as effectively as, now you're starting to see more of the suit and tie type people starting to have their own, experiences. And I give those people tremendous credit because they were ahead of the game. Me, but now sometimes I'm talking to people and I hear myself say something and I'm just like, man, I'm starting to sound like some of those people, right?
I do the same thing.
I try to be realistic. I'm a very research-based, objective type of person. But, sometimes I start talking about some experiences and consciousness and where I think things are going. I mean, for me, my main interest is altered states of consciousness. So that's really been my practice with psychedelics, is kind of exploring that altered states of consciousness. And sometimes you can get really deep down a rabbit hole with that and start talking about aliens and other wild stuff. And I'm like, I've come a long way.
Me too, bro.
Literally down the rabbit hole. Hey, Dustin, where can everybody keep up with the many things you have going on, social, web, all that stuff?
Yeah, so my personal IG is Dustin R10, DUSTIN R10. My investment fund, you could check out our website, iterinvestments.com, ITER, investments, plural.com. There's a contact link there. You could reach out to me through that as well.
Great, man. We really appreciate you coming on, and we'll have all that in the show notes today. Thank you so much, Dustin.
Appreciate it, guys.
Chris, any final words from you, my friend?
Rock and roll, baby. Hammer of the week. Let's go.
Hey, guys, you know where to find us, thevacaypodcast.com. You can find Chris and I as well on the old IG. Those blue checks before you could buy them. We'll see you next time.
Content discussed on this show is provided for reference and educational purposes. The content is not an attempt to practice medicine or provide specific medical advice. Always consult your personal physician for medical advice and proper diagnosis.
Thanks for listening. This is Vibe Science. To learn more or watch full episodes, visit vibesciencepodcast.com. Here's to discovering your highest vibe.